There are places in this world where the earth itself seems to remember, not with the soft, forgiving memory of old men recalling summer afternoons, but with the relentless, grinding memory of stone, cold, indifferent, and utterly without mercy. The land of the Ohio River Valley in the year 1841 was such a place. It stretched out beneath a sky that seemed too wide, too open, pressing down on the small figures of men and women who had chosen to plant themselves there, to drive stakes into the dark soil and call it home. They came with their axes and their Bibles and their iron plows, and they believed, as only the desperate and the faithful can believe, that hard work and righteousness were sufficient armor against whatever darkness the world might conjure. Elias Crane was such a man. He was not a complicated man, or at least, he did not believe himself to be one. He was 43 years old in the autumn of that year, lean as a fence post, with hands so weathered and cracked they resembled the bark of the elm trees that bordered his property to the north. He had come to this particular piece of Ohio earth from Pennsylvania, bringing with him his wife Ruth, his son Thomas, who was then 12 years old, and the particular kind of stubborn optimism that men carry when they have nothing else left to carry. He had paid good money for 80 acres of loam and clay, had built a house of rough-hewn timber, and had spent 7 years coaxing wheat and corn from the ground with a devotion that bordered on the religious. His neighbors, the Fullers to the east, the Harmon family 4 miles south along the creek road, would have described him as decent, quiet, a man who kept his word and paid his debts, a man who attended church on Sundays with the mechanical regularity of a well-maintained clock. They would not have described him as a man haunted by anything, because he did not appear to be, and because in 1841 in rural Ohio there was a particular social contract around suffering. You kept it indoors, you kept it quiet. You did not let it show in your face at the general store or during the hymns on Sunday morning. But the land had been speaking to Elias Crane for some time before he chose to listen. It began with the field he called the Lower 40. The Lower 40 was the southern portion of his property, a broad, flat expanse that sloped almost imperceptibly toward a stand of black walnut trees at its far edge. The soil there was darker than elsewhere on the farm, almost black when wet, and it held moisture longer than was natural, so that even in the dry weeks of late August, the Lower 40 remained damp underfoot, slightly yielding, as though the ground there had never fully committed to being solid. In his first years on the property, Elias had planted corn there and received good yields, not exceptional, but sufficient. By the 5th year, the yields had begun to decline. By the 7th, the corn came up stunted, the stalks pale and thin, the ears small and malformed, resembling in their twisted shapes things that Elias did not have the language to describe, but that troubled him in the hours before dawn when sleep withdrew and left him alone with his thoughts. He told himself it was the soil. He told himself he needed to rotate his crops, to rest the field, to amend the earth with lime and manure. He did these things. They did not help. The animals knew before he did. The draft horse, a broad gray gelding named Caesar, who had served him faithfully for 5 years, refused in the spring of 1841 to be led into the Lower 40. Elias had tried 3 times, each time watching the horse plant its hooves at the field's edge with an absolute, trembling certainty, the whites of its eyes showing, foam gathering at the corners of its mouth. It was not ordinary stubbornness. Elias had worked horses all his life, and he knew the difference between an animal being difficult and an animal being afraid. Caesar was afraid. His body communicated it with an eloquence that no human language could have matched. The shaking flanks, the desperate backward pressure against the lead, the low sounds rising from somewhere deep in the animal's chest that were not quite whinnying and not quite anything else Elias could name. The dogs would not go near that field at all. They had stopped approaching it sometime in late winter, and by March they would not even face in its direction. sitting with their backs to the lower 40 with an air of deliberate inattention that struck Elias, in his more reflective moments, as almost theatrical, as though they had agreed among themselves to pretend the field did not exist. His wife Ruth noticed the birds first, or rather, she noticed their absence. The starlings and crows that congregated in their other fields, picking through the turned earth for insects and seeds, did not go to the lower 40. Had not gone there, she realized, for the better part of a year. She mentioned this to Elias one evening at the supper table, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and then he said that birds were unpredictable creatures, and that he expected they had simply found better feeding elsewhere, and he returned to his meal. But Ruth had seen something pass across his face in that moment, a flicker of something she could not name, recognition, perhaps, or its darker cousin, confirmation, and she did not raise the subject again. Elias began going to the lower 40 alone in the early mornings, before Thomas was awake, before Ruth had the fire going in the kitchen stove. He told himself he was checking on the field, assessing the soil, planning his approach to the coming season's planting. He told himself this with such conviction that for a time he almost believed it. But the truth, which lived in a part of him that had no interest in comforting fictions, was that something in the lower 40 was calling to him, and he was answering. The field looked different in the early morning. The mist that gathered there, and it always gathered there, even on clear mornings when the rest of the farm stood in dry and ordinary air, gave the lower 40 the quality of a painting seen through water, the edges of things softened, the distances uncertain. The walnut trees at the far edge appeared to shift in position depending on the morning, sometimes seeming closer, sometimes receding to a distance that Elias could not reconcile with his knowledge of his own property. He had walked every inch of this land. He knew where those trees stood, and yet there were mornings when they seemed to stand at the edge of a horizon that had no business being where it was, at a remove that suggested not just distance, but a different order of reality altogether. He began to hear things in the field. This is where the telling becomes difficult, because Elias Crane was not a man given to fancy. He did not believe in ghosts in any theatrical sense. The luminous apparitions and clanking chains of popular literature struck him as absurd. He believed in the God of the Presbyterians, which was a God of strict accounting and limited sentiment, and he believed in the physical world as a place of labor and consequence. And yet what he heard in the lower 40 in those early morning hours did not fit within any category his practical mind had constructed. It was not a voice, exactly. It was more the suggestion of a voice, the way that certain silences have a texture that implies recent speech, the air still holding the shape of words that have just been withdrawn from it. He would stand at the center of the field, the mist moving around his knees, and he would feel certain that something had just finished speaking, that he had arrived one breath too late to hear it. This sensation intensified over the weeks of early spring, until by April, he was not simply feeling that speech had just ended, but that he was on the verge of comprehending it, that the words were not quite beyond his reach, but were waiting for something in him to open, to yield, to become sufficiently quiet that they could enter. He did not tell Ruth. He did not tell Thomas. He did not tell the Reverend Hartwell at the Presbyterian Church, though he sat across from that stern and careful man twice a week, and might have found the words if he had searched for them. He held his silence with the particular grip of a man who suspects that speaking a thing aloud might make it irrevocably real. In May, he found the first stone. He had been walking the lower 40 with a spade, turning the soil in preparation for what he had decided would be a planting of winter wheat, a practical decision, a sensible decision. A decision that had nothing to do with any other reason he might have for spending time in that field. The spade struck something hard at about 8 inches depth, and he knelt and cleared the soil away with his hands, and he found a stone, approximately the size and shape of a human skull. It was dark gray, almost black, and its surface was worked. He was certain of this, as certain as he had ever been of anything. not by nature, but by hands. There were markings cut into the stone in a regular pattern, rows of small angular incisions that were clearly deliberate, clearly meaningful, and completely unreadable to him. He sat with the stone in his hands for a long time. The mist moved. The walnut trees stood at their variable distance. The silence pressed in around him with its familiar suggestion of recent and nearly comprehensible speech. He brought the stone home and hid it in the barn, wrapped in a piece of canvas, beneath a loose board in the floor of the tack room. He told himself he would show it to someone, to the reverend, to one of the men who passed through the village claiming knowledge of such things, but he did not show it to anyone. He returned to the field the next morning and found another stone within the first hour of searching, and another the morning after that. By the end of May, he had unearthed 11 stones. They varied in size from the first skull-sized one to a piece no larger than his fist, but they all bore the same worked surface, the same angular markings, and they all came from the same general area of the lower 40, a roughly circular zone perhaps 30 feet in diameter near the field's center. He arranged them in the tack room in the order he had found them, wrapped in their separate pieces of canvas, and he visited them each evening before supper, with the hushed, systematic attention of a man performing a ritual he does not entirely understand. He had begun to translate them. This was the thing he could not explain, even to himself, even in the innermost chambers of his private mind. He had no knowledge of any system of writing other than the Roman alphabet and the Arabic numerals of his schooling. He had never studied linguistics or archaeology or any discipline that might have furnished him with tools for such a task. And yet the markings on the stones were beginning to yield to him, slowly, the way ice yields to a hand pressed against it. Not dissolving, but communicating, transmitting something through the barrier of its opacity. The words, if they were words, came to him not as sounds, but as images, as feelings, as sudden pressures behind his eyes that resolved into meaning before he could examine them closely enough to question them. They told him about the land, about what the land was, and what it had been, and what it wanted. They described a time before his time, before the time of any man he had knowledge of, when this particular piece of earth had been a place of intersection, a word he found himself using without knowing where it came from, a place where something that existed elsewhere, in some dimension running parallel to the physical world of labor and consequence that Elias had always inhabited, pressed close enough to the surface to be felt, to be touched, to be communicated with. The people who had carved these stones, and here the images became less clear, less precise, more like shadows seen through water than the relatively sharp transmissions of the earlier markings. Those people had known about the intersection. They had marked it. They had, in some way Elias could not quite resolve, made use of it, and they had, in the end, been consumed by it. This last understanding arrived in him on a Tuesday evening in June, as he knelt in the tack room among his wrapped stones, and it arrived not gradually, but all at once, with the force of a physical blow, so that he sat back on his heels and put his hand over his mouth and remained there for several minutes, breathing carefully. The people who had marked these stones had made contact with what lay beneath the lower 40, had opened some channel of communication or passage or exchange, and the thing on the other side of that channel had taken them apart. Not violently, not with the blunt drama of a physical assault, but slowly, over time, by degrees, by the careful withdrawal of whatever it is that makes a person coherent, integrated, themselves. Elias put this understanding away from him the way you put an object down when you realize it is too hot to hold. He wrapped his stones carefully and went into supper, and spoke to Ruth about the weather, and to Thomas about his lessons, and ate his food, and said his prayers, and went to bed. And in the morning he went back to the lower 40. He could not have told you why. Later, much later, in a different context, in a place where the question might have been put to him directly, he might have said that it was because the field had become, by then, the most real thing in his life. more real than the house, than the barn, than the faces of his wife and son, more real than the God of the Presbyterians and his strict accounting. The lower 40 had a quality of absolute presence that nothing else in Elias Crane's life could match, and once you have experienced that quality, that dense, unmediated realness, ordinary existence begins to seem like a painting of itself, a copy, a representation of something that only fully exists elsewhere. He knew this was wrong. He knew it in the part of him that was still a Presbyterian farmer with debts and duties and a family dependent on his function. But knowing and stopping are different operations, and he had begun to understand, somewhere in the territory between sleeping and waking, that he no longer had full control over the second one. Ruth began to see the change in him that summer. It came on gradually, and she would not have been able to point to a single morning and say, "Here, this is where he began to go." But by July she was certain that the man who sat across from her at meals, who worked the fields and maintained the equipment and said the correct words at the correct times, was operating at some remove from whatever it was that actually constituted Elias Crane. His eyes, which had always been a particular shade of gray-brown that she had thought of as warm in their mundane way, had changed. Not in color, but in quality. There was something absent in them that had previously been present, and something present in them that had previously been absent, and she could not have named either thing, but she felt both with the certainty of a woman who has shared a bed and a life with a man for 18 years. She found one of the stones. It was a Tuesday in August, and she had gone to the barn to look for a piece of rope for a purpose she would later be unable to recall. And the loose board in the tack room had been poorly replaced, the corner of it lifted just enough to catch her eye. She pulled it up and found the stones, wrapped in their canvas pieces, arranged in their careful order. She unwrapped one, the third one, as it happened, the one that had yielded to Elias the densest and most sustained sequence of transmissions. She held it in her hands and looked at the markings. She did not feel anything. This is important. She did not feel any of the pressure, the slow yielding of opacity, the images resolving into meaning that Elias had experienced. She held the stone and saw markings she could not read, and felt the weight of it, and felt a coldness in it that seemed disproportionate to the August temperature, even in the relative cool of the barn's interior. She put it back and replaced the board, and walked back to the house and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the lower 40 for a long time. She understood, standing there, that she was afraid. Not of the stone, or not only of the stone. She was afraid of what the stone implied about her husband, that he had found these things and hidden them, had kept them secret, had built around them a private world that excluded her, that the man who sat across from her at meals and said the correct words was managing a secret life of such depth and strangeness that she could not begin to calculate its extent. She confronted him that evening, quietly, carefully, in the way of a woman who has learned that directness requires precision. She told him she had found the stones. She told him she wanted to know what they were and where they had come from, and what he intended to do with them. Elias looked at her for a long moment. The look he gave her was the look, she would think afterward, of a man trying to remember how to speak a language he has been away from for some time. The look of effortful translation. And then he told her they were nothing. Old stones, possibly Indian, possibly just stones, he wasn't sure. He'd been meaning to show them to someone who might know more. He said this smoothly and completely, without hesitation, with a fluency that frightened her more than confusion or evasion would have, because she had never known Elias to be a fluent liar, had always taken his clumsy transparency as one of the fixed points of her world. He went to the barn that night. She heard him leave at 2 a.m, and she lay in the bed and listened to the silence and prayed, which she had not done with any real conviction since she was a girl, prayed to the God of the Presbyterians to please make whatever was happening stop. In the morning, Elias did not come in for breakfast. Thomas found him at 8 o'clock standing in the center of the lower 40, standing completely still, facing the walnut trees at the field's far edge. Thomas called to him, and he did not respond. Thomas walked out into the field and took his father's arm, and felt the arm rigid and immovable under his hand, the muscles locked, the whole body like a piece of the earth itself, rooted, present, and entirely elsewhere. It took Thomas and Ruth together to move him, each holding an arm, walking him slowly back across the field and into the house. And throughout this process, Elias made no sound and offered neither assistance nor resistance. His eyes were open. They were looking at something that was not in the kitchen where they seated him, not in the physical room with its familiar smells of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular domestic smell of their lived-together life. His eyes were looking at something that was very far away, or perhaps very close, much closer than the kitchen walls, but accessible only from a direction that had no name in the ordinary geometry of rooms and fields and human habitation. He came back, slowly, over the course of that day. By afternoon he was speaking. By evening he was eating. He did not explain where he had been, and he did not ask how long he had been standing in the field, and neither Ruth nor Thomas could find a way to ask him directly, because the asking felt like it might break something that was currently, precariously, holding. He went to the lower 40 again the next morning before dawn. Ruth found him at the field's edge this time, not in its center. He was kneeling at the edge of the area where he had unearthed his stones, and he was digging with his hands. His fingernails were torn and bleeding, and he did not appear to notice. He was digging with the concentrated, rhythmic purposefulness of a man following instructions, and his lips were moving, and from a distance, in the pre-dawn gray, he looked like a man in fervent prayer. The posture was almost identical, the kneeling, the bent head, the moving lips, the complete absorption. She stood at the field's edge and called his name. He stopped digging. He did not look at her. He sat back on his heels and put his bloody hands on his thighs and was still. And then, after a long moment, he said, without turning, "There is something here, Ruth. There is something here that has been waiting for a long time." She asked him what it was. He said, "I believe it is the place where the world is thinnest." She told him to come inside, and he did, stood and walked past her without meeting her eyes, went inside, washed his hands at the basin, sat at the table. And she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the lower 40 and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, that she was losing her husband. Not to drink, not to another woman, not to any of the failures she might have feared and prepared for. She was losing him to the ground itself, to a particular piece of dark Ohio earth that was drawing him inward, downward, with the patient, absolute authority of gravity. She wrote to her brother in Pennsylvania. She wrote to the Reverend Hartwell. She asked the Reverend to call, saying that Elias had been unwell, that she was worried about his spiritual condition, choosing these words with care because they were true, and because they were also the kind of words a Presbyterian minister was equipped to respond to. Hartwell came on a Thursday, riding his gray mare up the track to the farmhouse with the slightly self-important bearing of a man who is accustomed to being sent for. He spoke with Elias for 2 hours in the sitting room. Ruth served them coffee and did not stay, but she listened from the kitchen, and what she heard was a conversation of 2 parallel tracks that never intersected. Hartwell spoke of Scripture, of the temptations of isolation, of the importance of community and worship, and keeping the mind occupied with righteous labor. Elias responded to each of these points in a manner that was entirely appropriate and entirely hollow. The responses of a man who has memorized the expected answers to questions he no longer experiences as relevant. At no point did he mention the stones. At no point did he mention the field. He performed the conversation of a troubled but essentially rational Presbyterian farmer, with a fluency that must have satisfied the Reverend, because Hartwell left after those 2 hours in good spirits, clapping Elias on the shoulder at the door, telling Ruth that her husband was a sound man who would benefit from more regular attendance at services. After Hartwell had gone, Elias stood at the kitchen window, the same window from which Ruth had watched the lower 40 through all those weeks, and he looked out at the field, and he smiled. It was the first smile Ruth had seen on his face in months, and it was the most frightening thing she had witnessed in her marriage, because it was not his smile. It occupied the correct position on his face, and used the correct muscles, and performed all the functions of a smile, but it was something else wearing a smile, looking out through Elias Crane's eyes at Elias Crane's field, satisfied with something she was not permitted to understand. She took Thomas to the Harmon's farm the following morning, telling him that she needed him to help with some work there, that he should stay for a few days. Thomas was 16 by now, quiet and careful in the way of a boy who has been watching his parents and understanding more than they believed. He went without argument, but at the Harmon's gate he turned and looked at her and said, "Mama, what is happening?" And she could not answer him. She kissed his forehead and rode back to the farm and put Caesar in the pasture as far from the lower 40 as the fence lines allowed, and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and waited. Elias did not come in that night. She sat by the window and watched the lower 40 in the dark, and she could not see him, but she knew he was there. The field had a different quality of darkness than the surrounding land, not lighter but more present, more textured, as though the darkness there was a substance rather than an absence. She watched it for hours. At some point before dawn she saw, or believed she saw, and has never been certain of the distinction, something in the field. A light. Not large, not dramatic. The size of a lantern flame, but not a lantern flame. Steadier, more uniform, without the flicker of combustion. It stood approximately where she calculated the center of the field to be, the area where the stones had been found, the area where Elias had been kneeling and digging with his bleeding hands. It was there for perhaps 3 minutes, and then it was not there. She found him the next morning in the tack room, sitting among his stones. He had unwrapped them all and arranged them on the floor of the tack room in a pattern she could see had meaning, a structure, a grammar, the stones positioned in relation to each other with the precise intentionality of letters on a page. He was sitting in the center of this arrangement, and he was breathing slowly, and his eyes were closed, and she stood in the doorway and said his name 3 times before he opened them. He looked at her, and for a moment, she would hold this moment in her memory for the rest of her life, which would be long and largely elsewhere. For a moment, she saw him, Elias, the actual man, not the performance or the vacancy or the thing wearing his face. He looked at her from some great depth, from some distance that had nothing to do with the physical proximity of the tack room, and she saw in his face grief of a specific and unbearable kind, the grief of a man who can see the shore from which he is being carried, and who has lost the strength or the will to swim back to it. He said her name. He said, "Ruth, I can't come back from it now." She stepped toward him. She reached for his hand. He looked down at her hand on his, and then he looked back up at her, and whatever she had seen, the glimpse, the real man, the grief, was gone, replaced by the smooth, impenetrable composure of someone who has completed a negotiation. He was not at the farm when she returned from taking Thomas home 3 days later. He was not anywhere she looked. Caesar stood in the pasture, alert and watching, facing the lower 40 with his ears pricked forward, which was new. The horse watching the field with something that was no longer avoidance but attention, as if something in that field had changed, as if the thing that had frightened him was no longer there to be afraid of, as if it had gotten what it came for. The stones were gone from the tack room. The pattern they had formed on the floor was gone. There was no trace of them, and no trace of Elias Crane. The neighbors searched. The Reverend Hartwell organized parties to walk the surrounding land and the creek and the margin of the walnut trees. They found nothing. No one searched the lower 40. This is the detail that has stayed with me, moving through this story like a cold current in warm water. No one suggested searching the lower 40. It was as though by collective and unspoken agreement, the community understood that whatever had happened in that field, and that the field was not a place where human searching would yield anything that human beings were prepared to receive. Ruth sold the farm the following spring. She took Thomas and went back to Pennsylvania and lived quietly and did not speak of these events to anyone who was not already among the small circle who knew. The farm passed through several owners in quick succession. None of them stayed. The lower 40 was never successfully cultivated again. By 1860, the farm had been abandoned altogether, the house falling inward on itself with the slow patience of wood returning to earth. The land is still there. It looks like ordinary Ohio farmland now, which is the most frightening thing about it. The absolute ordinariness of its appearance, the grass growing and the wind moving through it in the usual way, the sky above it, the same unexceptional sky that covers all the surrounding country. You could walk across it and feel nothing. Most people do. Most people move through the world feeling nothing from the places that have consumed everything from the people who came before them. And this is perhaps a mercy. Perhaps the most fundamental mercy that ordinary life extends to ordinary people. But the earth remembers. It remembers in its own cold, indifferent way, with the patience of something that has no need to be in a hurry, that has been here since before the first man drove his stake into the ground and called it home. And in some places, in the places where the world is thinnest, as Elias Crane said on that gray morning in the field with his bloody hands and his moving lips, in those places, the memory is not passive. It is not the merely preserved record of what happened. It is active, it is present, it is turning in the darkness like a wheel that has never stopped turning, and it is waiting, with a patience that makes the patience of stone seem almost hurried, for the next man to come walking into a field in the early morning, drawn by something he cannot name, answering something he cannot quite hear, believing in his practical and faithful heart that he is only checking on the soil.